Finding Hope, the Road to Recovery.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Finding Hope, the Road to Recovery. My name is Cassidy Todd, and I am a clinical supervisor at Tarzana Treatment Centers in our youth SUD program. And I'm joined today by Gavin Graham, who is a substance use disorder counselor in our youth program as well. Today, we're going to be in conversation about treating the whole child in substance use treatment, and really hoping to give some information on what our field looks like, what we do, and the passion that we have, and hopefully that reaches folks that may need it. So Gavin, to start off, I'd love to know what even got you interested in being a substance use disorder counselor?
Well, I think it started with just kind of an overall desire to help people. And, I didn't want to have a job where I was just working for the money, where I'm just doing it for the money. And, I knew that whatever job I chose was inevitably going to become like a huge part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to be living and spending my day to day just with the goal of attaining money. I wanted to have a job that was also fulfilling. So originally I thought I'd become a therapist, and I was in school to get my BA in psychology. And then my friend told me about substance use counseling, because he was a substance use counselor, which I didn't even know was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And once he described that to me, I was kind of like, okay, that's it. That's what I want to do. Because I identified the substance use issue as being one of the biggest issues plaguing our youth today.
Mm-hmm.
And, I guess I'm Gen Z, right? Because I was born in 2000. So, in my own experience and seeing stuff that my friends struggled with in high school and seeing kind of the way that the culture is moving, it really is such an issue. And there's so many voices and so many different people in the media and music and TV,
Mm-hmm.
all encouraging the youth to engage in drug use,
Mm-hmm.
to engage in substance use. And it really, saddened me to see them preying upon the youth and the vulnerable. And so I decided my hope is that I could be one of the voices on the opposite end, trying to tell them to do something else, right? Find healthy alternatives.
Yeah, absolutely. So trying to kind of like provide a different perspective from what they're just being inundated with all the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Was there something that you think really drew you to working with youth specifically?
I think I like how creative and open they are. I like the minds of the youth because a lot of times they're not as boxed into routines. They're not as boxed into ideas,
Mm-hmm.
right? And sometimes that can make them more malleable to introducing new ideas. And honestly, they're just fun to work with. It's always exciting working with the youth.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember for myself, because I went to school for clinical psychology, and substance use wasn't really on my radar. That wasn't something that I planned to do with my career. I fell into it. But now that I've been in the field for a few years at this point, you're absolutely right that there's such a connection between what our youth are going through nowadays and substance use. You really can't disentangle those two concepts. And for a youth struggling with any aspect of their life, if it's mental health or friendships or grades or family, the common things that teenagers and other youth are really struggling with, substance use is kind of right there knocking on the back door, either contributing to that or it's just kind of whispering in their ear. But it's funny, you mentioned that you were Gen Z, I'm millennial.
Yeah.
This really isn't how I grew up. Like, I don't think that we had this kind of exposure and this kind of accessibility when I was younger that people do now. And I see it really just continuing to get worse. So it's great that there's folks like you that want to work with these youth. And like you said, just want to help provide the alternatives, because it really is an epidemic where it's everywhere. They really can't escape it. They go to school, there's drugs. They come home, it's on the TV. They open up Instagram or Snapchat, it's there. There's no aspect of their life that doesn't line up with drugs, with alcohol, with substance use. So we need people like you and other people who have that passion and who want to help to really be the guiding force for the youth.
Thank you for saying that. And no, yeah, you're so right. I mean, it's in the music, movies, social media, some if it's more subliminal than others with how like overtly they're encouraging it. But yeah, it is a big issue, and I do what I can to try to combat it. But it's a big problem, and I try to just focus on what I can do rather than looking at the whole thing as a whole, because that can get overwhelming.
Yeah.
But I think the more people there are that are all fighting the same fight and all trying to achieve the same purpose, then it all comes together, and we're more able to tackle this big issue.
Definitely. And when you told family or friends or whoever else in your life that, hey, this is what I think I want to do with my life, and kind of I'm going into this area of substance use counseling, what was their reaction? Did they have like an idea of what that even was?
Their reaction mostly was just like, oof, like, that's rough. They were like, that's rough. You're trying to tell teenagers not to do drugs. And that obviously is very hard, because the teenage years are kind of the years where you experiment with that stuff. And obviously teenagers don't want to have anybody come to them telling them, don't do something, right? They don't want to be told what to do. And as soon as someone says, hey, don't do this, that makes them want to do it even more. So I think that's where motivational interviewing and stuff comes in, which for those who are unaware, motivational interviewing is kind of like just asking questions and kind of getting the youth or the patient or whoever you might be talking to come to the conclusion on their own. Instead of just saying, hey, don't do drugs, you ask questions that get them to realize that through their own cognition and through their own mental process, that not doing drugs is going to put them in the best place possible. But it has to come from them. They have to think that it's their own idea. And I think that's where, like,
absolutely,
that's what the best counselors are good at, is like getting someone to come up with the idea that deep down you want them to arrive at, but getting them to think that they came up with it by themselves organically.
Do you find that that's hard?
Yeah, it definitely can be, because a lot of people are stuck in certain processes, mental processes, certain thought patterns. And I think it's difficult, especially with the youth as compared to adults, because with adults, it's more obvious what the issue is. With adults, they can say, oh, I lost this because of my substance use. They've seen the effects of their substance use more visibly and more practically in their life. They've had these bad effects. But with the youth, it's more of like through the motivational interviewing, like I was talking about, getting them to see where their life is going if they continue with the path that they're on, and trying to, get them to see where the decisions that they're making are taking them, because a lot of it hasn't happened yet. For them, it's still, they might be still in an experimental drug use phase where the big, horrible things that inevitably come with a lifetime of substance use, they haven't experienced that yet. So just kind of trying to get them to stop before that happens, and I think that's another, you talked about things that I like about working with the youth. I like the fact that I can get in there before these things happen and hopefully divert the path a little bit so that they don't have those severe negative consequences later in life.
Yeah. It's like looking at it from a developmental perspective, right? Where we know that we are getting to work with these kids at a really vulnerable time in their life, and at a time where developmentally there are going to be challenges, like you mentioned. But we also know that if we can intervene, then 20, 30, 40 years down the line, you're not looking at somebody that's struggled with addiction for the past few decades and is now trying to stop after losing everything.
Yeah.
We look at, I think I can speak for both of us when I say we look at the youth that we work with and we see so much hope in them.
Definitely.
And I know obviously there's barriers and stuff, but maybe you can speak a little bit to what are some of the moments that really stand out to you that made you feel like, yeah, this is why I'm doing this work.
I think seeing the youth divert their energy from the substance use into some of the stuff that they're passionate about, and seeing them kind of like really light up with that passion. And, we work with so many kids, and I mean, I think that all kids, have such a potential, to do such great things.
Yeah.
And when they're spending their time getting high and getting intoxicated, that can kind of dull some of their ability to actualize their full potential. And so seeing them get free from all of that a little bit, and then they have all this energy and they have all this time. I think that's one of the main things that I work with the kids is like, okay, you spend all your time getting high right now, trying to get them to stop doing that. But then once you stop doing that, what do you do with your day?
Exactly.
And having them figure out what they're passionate about, what they enjoy doing, and then you see them start to do that stuff, and it really is beautiful, like what they're capable of at that age. Is so much potential and so much talent.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think there's barriers that go along with like the families that we work with? Because if we're working with kids, there's obviously parents, there's somebody involved in their life. Do you feel like there's barriers with the adults in the situation that make it difficult for them to find that potential?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of times, people come in with biases, right? And like certain preconceived notions about substance use. They themselves might use substances to an extent, and they're like, okay, this is normal. I use substances in this capacity at this age, or maybe they don't know how serious it is, and they themselves use substances, and they think, okay, well, my kid's just doing a little bit of what I'm doing. It's not a big deal. And then also, I think like when they come in to treatment, it is kind of like a big official ordeal, right?
Yeah.
And they come in, and we have to bill their insurance, and we have to ask them all these questions, and I think it becomes real for them in that moment. And sometimes that can kind of scare them a little bit, and they can be like, okay, well, maybe we're not here yet. Like, I don't know if this is what I want for my kid, something this serious. But I think that also is just like part of kind of the way that we run things, the way that we have to run things with paperwork. It does have to be a serious thing. Yeah. But the individual counseling and the group counseling and whatnot is not that serious, right? It's like, it's casual, it's conversational.
Yeah, it's for the youth.
Yeah, exactly. The intake itself is very like questions based. It feels very official. It feels very serious. And I think sometimes that can scare youth and parents a little bit, because they're like, oh, this is a real serious thing that I'm engaging in. Yeah. And then again, like there's a lot of stigma with substance use in general, right? Like people are willing to go into mental health treatment, and that's become more of an accepted thing of like, okay, everyone can benefit from therapy, but there's still a lot of negative connotations that are tied to substance use that I think we as a culture kind of have to overcome.
Absolutely. Probably especially like some of the big substances that we're seeing now, like Xanax, fentanyl. We know that these things are occurring at a much higher rate than they once were, or that we once were aware of.
Yeah.
And it's no longer just, kids smoking weed after school. They're taking these very serious things that they're getting off the street from sources where we have no idea what's actually in them.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the times the parents don't know that.
Yeah.
Parents aren't always privy to every part of their kids' lives.
Yeah.
And I think that is a big barrier, is that we're kind of having to break the news to the parents sometimes that, hey, there's something really scary going on with your kid right now. And we're here to help. But first we have to face that in order to really address it. I think that's hard for a parent to realize. I know for myself, I'm a parent myself now, and that would be hard for me, even working in this field, to have to face, okay, this is like, it's like a big breath. Like, this is real. This is a thing. Like you're saying, going in to do an intake, filling out paperwork, billing insurance. Now it feels real. Now it feels like I really have to face what is happening with my child. And that can be really scary. And that can be really stigmatizing, especially depending on the community that family's in. Like, what are family members going to say? What are friends going to say? What are they going to think? How are they going to perceive the parents in that situation? Like, it feels a lot of the time like we're kind of battling the addiction, and then we're battling the stigma that this family is experiencing related to it, to even break through to help the kid in that way.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you think that there is a future where substance use treatment isn't as stigmatized? Like you mentioned how mental health, we've kind of really worked as a society to destigmatize. do you see a future where we can have that for substance use treatment as well?
I think so. Yeah. As I said, like the issue right now is just getting worse. So I
Mm-hmm.
think the need for substance use is just going to keep increasing.
Yeah.
You know, that's unfortunate, right? I would love for there not to be such a big need for substance
Mm-hmm.
use, even if it might put me out of a job. But it's, yeah, it's just getting worse. And that seems like the way that the culture is heading is like more substance use. And, you know, we see kids coming in younger and younger. We see them coming in using hardcore substances,
Mm-hmm.
younger and younger, dangerous, you know, lethal substances at a younger and younger age. And yeah, I see substance use treatment growing exponentially. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's going to become something that's more integrated, hopefully, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because as substance use is more integrated in the culture, substance use treatment has to be in order to balance that
Yeah.
out, in order to
Yeah.
find that balance. So like having people go into the schools, which is something that, you know, I've begun doing,
Mm-hmm.
and doing substance use treatment in the schools, which is kind of a new thing
Yeah.
overall. I think that's something that we're going to see more and more, you know,
Mm-hmm.
where like they've always had mental health professionals in the schools,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll have therapists in the schools, but having a substance use counselor in the schools is kind of a new thing. But I think it makes sense with what you see on the news of, you know, kids overdosing at school,
Mm-hmm.
kids, you know, high in school. And, you know, this is bringing in some other stuff, but, you know, with the vapes and stuff, like kids
Yeah.
are able to get high at school in a capacity they used to not be able to. Like, it used to be that, you know, you couldn't smoke like a cigarette or weed at school because everyone would smell it, right? It would be
Exactly.
super noticeable. You
Mm-hmm.
can't go into the bathroom and smoke a joint. But
Mm-hmm.
nowadays, the kids can go into the bathroom and use like the weed vape pens
Mm-hmm.
or the weed marijuana disposables, and I mean it's happening at such a higher rate
Yeah.
to where, you know, it's you know, I feel for the teachers because they have all these kids that are in class and intoxicated and stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
it's such a big issue nowadays. And so
Yeah.
I think having the substance use counselor on campus, that's a big change that's happening. I think just people going to that sooner, you know, to where it
Absolutely.
doesn't have to be something where, you know, God forbid the youth has to overdose to come into treatment.
Mm-hmm.
It could just be getting caught with weed once, you know, and we can
Yeah.
work with them on that and talk to them about it and talk to them about refusal skills, about, you know, prevention. We can do
Mm-hmm.
prevention. Even if a kid has gotten caught and doesn't want to do it again, like we can work with them on that relapse prevention as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think people not having that stigma around substance use hopefully will allow them to come in sooner,
Mm-hmm.
before it gets as serious as like an overdose, and to where they're like, okay, we really need to do something about this. And just coming in when those first signs start to present themselves.
Yeah. And just to pick your brain a little bit, because of you're in this field, it's what you see, you're in the schools, you're in the community. What do you think it is that stops youth or families from coming in sooner? Because you mentioned even like it's not just, a hit of marijuana and then that's it. It's all day use now. It's like they're able to go vape in the bathrooms in between classes, during class. They're able to covertly take a pill. And I think that we used to have this idea that like, oh, kids are just smoking, weed behind the bleachers. And it's really not what it is anymore. It's not like that.
Yeah.
But what do you think is the thing that stops people from coming in when it really is just one hit of weed or a curiosity?
Yeah.
Why do you think people wait until so much later?
I think it can be like a not knowing about
Mm-hmm.
it. Like I said, it's so much easier to hide with the weed vapes and whatnot. And you know, a lot of parents, like there's new types of vapes coming out every day,
Yeah.
right? And so they might not know what that looks like. They might see a vape and think, oh, is that some device that they're using for school?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like they might be familiar with what cannabis looks like, they might be familiar with what a joint looks like, but some of these new objects that are coming out, they might not be familiar with exactly what that is.
Mm-hmm.
I think not knowing from the perspective of just not being around, like a lot of parents, you know, they work so much that they might only see their kid at a certain time in the day.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of easier for the kid, which, I don't blame the parents for. That's, people have to do what they have to do. You have to work. So, but it can be easier for the youth to mask their intoxication for that one period in time. They're like, okay, I'm going to see my parents for this small amount of time. Let me just make sure that I'm not noticeably intoxicated for that amount of time. And then before and after, they can be more. I think just a normalization too. There's like some normalizing of it.
Yeah.
When it's something as small as, well, I don't want to say small, but when it's at the beginning stages, it can be normalized, and it can be like, okay, well, this is experimenting, stuff that all kids do, but it's engaging in behaviors that, if you continue to engage in these behaviors, it can lead you down a very dark path. And I mean, it's the same, like someone who does like cocaine, heroin, pills and stuff, they're doing it for the same reasons as someone who is smoking weed, right? They want to feel differently. They want to go to a substance to feel better than the way that they feel. And so it's the beginning of a habit that you need to kind of address immediately. And try to find healthier alternatives. And it's a mindset, right? To try to teach people that to feel better than you're feeling, you might have to do something that in the moment might be uncomfortable, but then eventually it's going to feel good. Whereas substance use might feel good initially when you do it, but then it's going to lead to feeling worse. I really feel like there's this inverse relationship of like doing things that are uncomfortable will make you feel better afterwards, right? Like working out, studying, all these things we don't want to, people don't really want to do them, but after you do them, you feel better. But then on the opposite end, there's substance use, and it's, it might feel good in the moment, it might feel good for a certain amount of time, but then there's that drop off of dopamine or whatever the neurotransmitter may be, and you end up in a deficit. And so getting that idea of like, okay, if I feel bad, I can just go to a substance, getting that idea early on is so important.
Yeah. And I think too, like you really just touched on basically the topic of this conversation, which is the whole child. Like it's not just the kid. We're talking about the home environment, the family. If a kid can't be monitored all of the time, how can we create a supportive environment? There's so much more that we do than just like sitting with them in an office one-on-one, right? We're trying to connect them to resources. We're trying to get them into hobbies, into things that will help them build long-lasting, healthy, adaptive relationships. And I think that's a big piece of counseling that people don't really know about. They think you're just an addict. You have to go to this, center and deal with it. But really it's creating a person that is going to have a productive and positive life overall.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gavin.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this time, and we will see you next time.
Hello and welcome back to the second part of our episode on treating the whole child. As you know, I'm Gavin, substance use counselor with the youth, and Cassidy, clinical supervisor for the youth.
Yep.
Same people as before. Switch seats, and I'll be doing the question asking. We'll start off with, how did you get into this field? How did you become, where you're at now, top of the food chain? And what did that process look like? What motivated you to want to get into that?
Yeah. So I went to grad school for clinical psychology. So I got a graduate degree in that. My whole goal was to be a therapist. Like I really thought that I would just be working in private practice, treating anxiety in kids. I've always loved working with kids. But before I came to Tarzana, I was actually a substance use counselor at one of my training sites. And I really loved that there was so many facets to substance use counseling. You're working with this behavior. You're also working with, some of the mental health and establishing healthy coping skills and working with the family and helping create a better environment. And I really connected with that. So when I came to Tarzana, I really loved working on that side of things. Still love mental health, but I think that there's something so unique about SUD treatment because it's not as known about. People don't quite understand what that even means a lot of the time. And so coming to Tarzana, I really found myself connecting with that program and eventually found myself in the supervisor position when something opened up. I learned, all of the back end of everything between, insurance and funding sources and all of that, business side of stuff that allows us to do what we're doing. And I think that that made me feel even more passionate about it because knowing that there could potentially be so many barriers to even just getting in the door for these families and knowing the folks that we work with and that they're already coming from communities where there are going to be additional barriers. I really wanted to be able to be in a position where I could try and mitigate that as much as possible and still stay connected to the youth. And now I'm in the position where I get to work with counselors like you and really watch you all kind of come into your own as counselors and almost like working vicariously with the youth through you and the other counselors that we work with.
Yeah. So what does that look like a day to day in the life of a supervisor? Like what are your roles? What is a day to day experience like for you?
Yeah. I mean, as you know, at Tarzana, every day is a little different.
Yeah.
Especially working with kids, you really can't predict one day to the next. Ultimately, I view my position as being the support for you and for the other counselors there. So I'm always thinking of like, how can I do my job better to make your job as easy as possible so you can truly just focus on helping the youth? Because that's why we're all there at the end of the day. So, I'm attending meetings and doing all of that fun stuff, but ultimately I'm there to support my team. And so that means that I'm running supervisions with all of my staff where we can talk about the different cases, conceptualize the youth that we're working with, come up with different ideas for interventions, or if, counselors are really stuck in certain places, we can collaborate on that. I will step into sessions when I need to. Sometimes we get families, kind of like we were talking about in the first part, where they really struggle with understanding what's going on with their kid. And sometimes that lack of understanding leads to anger or to bigger feelings about it. So I'm there to help in those moments where, parents or youth are really having big reactions to things. So I can work with the counselor in that session to calm everything down and make sure that we're still able to do the work that we need to do. And I like to interact with the youth as much as I can. I mean, that's why I'm in the field. I never saw myself as being someone that just sits behind a computer screen. I really want to be out there doing it still. So, I mean, you've seen it. I'll step in to facilitate groups if I need to. I love being able to talk with the youth in our milieu, or they'll swing by my office looking for snacks or whatever else. But ultimately, my day is structured so that I can be a support to the staff that work there so that we can keep helping the youth that we serve.
And you do it so well. If I can
Thanks,
say
Gavin.
that and reinforce what she's saying, she isn't just saying this, she definitely walks the talk. And, in my experience, she's been such a benefit to me and helping me in my journey as through learning this, right? Because this was my first time working as a substance use counselor, was with Tarzana. And so in those moments where things get intense, crisis and whatnot, being able to go to you, even if I have an idea of, not to say that I don't know what I'm doing in certain situations, but even then, even if I feel comfortable with what I'm doing, just still running it by you, and you've always made the communication so comfortable, and we've always had such an open line of communication. I think that has been so beneficial to me. If I can say my experience of working with you, I think that's one of my favorite parts about having you as a supervisor is that we have this open communication. We have a good relationship to where, we talk about things out just in the day. I'll come see you and come say hi and just talk to you so that when things do get tough and when stuff does hit the fan, as they say, I can just go to you and it doesn't feel like uncomfortable. I don't have any blocks to come to you, right? Because it's like, okay, I'm just going to Cassidy.
Yeah.
I talk to her every day. It's not like a normal thing. It's not like this scary supervisor right? That some people, have that stereotype of a supervisor.
Yeah, I think the word is so weird. It feels very like all imposing or anything like that. But I'm
Yeah.
glad that it's really good feedback to hear that, because I think at the end of the day, I want to make sure that you all can just do your job. And I think that's the mark of a good supervisor, is like, how are they supporting their staff? And I'll be honest, a lot of the times when folks call me into sessions or like come ask a question, you all know the answer already. You know what to do. You've got it. I think there's just that presence of kind of like, okay, you got it. Like, let's see what you can do. Because I want you all to be able to go out into the world and do this job on your own and be confident in your abilities, because you all have it. I've seen you and the other counselors work with the youth. You've absolutely got those skills. I'm kind of just there as your backup.
Yeah.
Like, just when you really need it, I'll be there. But I think it's to boost your confidence, because I know that you can do it. I've seen those skills in you.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes too, there's like an aspect of just making sure that like all of our I's are dotted and T's are crossed when it comes to risk assessment with our kids, because working with youth can like have certain situations come up. We've got to be really mindful of their safety, of their family safety, of other kids in the household safety. So I think that's really where I step in the most, probably. I don't know if you agree with that, but just making sure that those situations are perfectly handled and we don't have, we're doing our part. We're doing our due diligence with the kids that we work with.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you on that for sure. It's nice to have someone higher up to like go to and say, hey, is this right? And then they say yes, and then you feel like more reassured in it, right? And it might have been what you were planning on doing, but to have someone, with the experience that you have, with the credentials that you have, tell you, okay, that's the right thing to do. It's like, all right, it's a little bit of vindication and a little bit of reassurance is definitely helpful. We talked a little bit in the first part about challenges and some of the challenges that I've had, but because you've had this experience with lots of different counselors and them all coming to you with their issues, what are some of like the main things that people struggle with, things that the counselors come to you with, and how do you help them resolve that?
Yeah. I think in terms of like the clinical care that we provide for the youth, the biggest and ongoing challenge that counselors across the board face is barriers within the family. And that can mean a number of different things. It can mean, parents aren't really wanting to engage with us and we're trying to safety plan, or we're trying to, remove drugs from the household, like getting parents to even just do a room sweep to help this kid, or getting parents to bring their kid into the office. Our youth are so reliant on their systems because they're still kids at the end of the day. And I think that's consistently the hardest part, is when there are barriers within the family unit that aren't necessarily because of the kid. And that can be for a number of different reasons, right? It could be that, financial stress, parents are working 2, 3, 4 jobs to be able to make ends meet. It could be parents or caregivers are struggling with their own mental health or substance use issues, and it makes it more difficult for them to be as present and involved as could be beneficial for that kid. Or it could just honestly be exhaustion in the family. As we know with our youth, they're such amazing kids, and we also see how difficult it can be because they're really in like the throes of their addiction and in their struggles. And they're so smart and so resilient, and sometimes they use that in maladaptive ways, and the families are the ones having to deal with it. So if your kid is running away every other day and you're constantly having to find them or call the police, or you're getting phone calls from school all the time because your kid is using at school again, or you're taking them to the hospital, and now I've got to take them to treatment 3-4 days a week, it's a lot for a parent. And sometimes I feel like I'm cheerleader for the families of like, all right, I know it's hard, but we can do it, because we want to be the support for them as well. But I think that is ultimately the biggest barrier, is that our kids are products of their system. They exist in their system. And so we've got to work with the system. And sometimes we don't have as much control over that because we aren't able to see all of their parents and teachers or caregivers or siblings 3-4 times a week in our office the way that we are the youth. And so that's something that I really try to work with the counselors on, is like, how do we engage the family in the right way and encourage and empower? And also, how do we know when we need to kind of turn our attention to the youth and work on how can they be their advocate? Because it may not happen with the family the way that we want it to, or that we know it should.
Yeah.
I think too, just generally, like the mindset that youth have nowadays. We talked a bit about, like, it's just everywhere, media, social media, friends, drugs, alcohol, everywhere. The youth, I think, have this true idea that it's not a big deal, that everyone smokes weed, it's legal, even though it's not legal for them.
Yeah.
They will come back with like every argument to every counterpoint we make. And really it comes down to development, like their brain development, the stage that they are at. It's going to be really, really hard for them to truly look 5-10 years down the road and connect that to consequences. They're very much like in the here and now. And that's no fault of their own. It's just the teenage brain. It's what they got going on.
Yeah.
And that can be really frustrating for counselors when they're like, I don't understand how they can't see it. They just landed in the hospital because they took a pill or they overdosed or something was laced, and they come out and they're doing it right again. And they're like, oh, I don't know, it's just a bad batch.
Yeah.
They can't connect it. And so really working with that frustration and like kind of chipping away at the walls that these kids build up and at every argument that they'll throw at us to try and get through to them.
Yeah.
But those are definitely two of the biggest barriers that I think we see in our office, at least.
And one that I wanted to get your input on,
Mm-hmm.
and that, I've struggled with a little bit, and in talking to other counselors, I've noticed this is like a common thing that comes up, is like, how do you protect your own well-being and your own mental health, your own headspace? Because, the advice obviously that people give is like, leave work at work. When you go home, don't be thinking about work. But like you said, we're working with these kids in, like you said, the throes of their addiction, and they're really going through it, and there can be some really intense things that happen. And it's difficult to, when you go home, not have some of that stuff linger with you, and not be thinking about like, oh man, how can I do this better? Or, should I have said something different in this situation? Should I have done? Or just thinking about the kid and worrying about them and thinking, oh, I hope that this kid is doing all right, because the last time that I saw them, they weren't. Yeah. Right. And so I think it's very difficult as a counselor to keep work at work, and keep that sectioned off, and then also not get too invested. Is that something that you've seen a lot with people, and what's like the advice that you give them? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is kind of the common challenge, right, in our field. And I think, I'm not perfect at it either. Like, it's something that I'm consistently having to work at as well. And when we're working in the field of counseling, that relationship that we have with the youth and that compassion and that empathy that we have for them, that's what makes us good at what we do. And that's what allows the youth to know that we care and we're going to keep showing up for you. There is the cost to that, though, and it's exactly what you're talking about, kind of like that burnout or like that feeling of being overwhelmed or like not being able to get the kid out of your mind because you know that they're at risk and you care about them genuinely. We genuinely care about these kids we work with. And what I usually tell people is that, it's a learned skill. It's not something that you're just going to be able to do overnight, or at least I've never met anyone that's able to just truly shut it off and be like, all right, I walked out of the building, I'm done thinking about it now. Yeah. Because we're humans. Yeah. We're going to carry that stuff with us, and we have real emotional reactions to the stuff that we're hearing these kids tell us. Yeah. And so one is you have to practice it. It has to be like a conscious, intentional thing that you're doing every day. And how you do that is having things outside of work that keep you grounded, that keep you sane, your hobbies or your coping skills or your self-care. So my biggest advice to people is find what that is for you, whether it's, going on a walk or listening to podcasts or like completely vegging out when you get home. If it's connection, do you go home and talk to your family or a partner or friends? Not even necessarily about work, because obviously we have like that confidentiality, but about anything, something that makes you grounded into your life and into what you're doing is helpful. When you walk out of the building, do the thing that keeps you grounded into your personal life. And then the second big thing is talk to your supervisor about it.
There's this thing that we call countertransference, which is just like when we're working with a client as a counselor or a therapist, we have a reaction to what they're saying, to what they're feeling, because we're human. And that's the countertransference. So supervision is really where you can work through some of that, of like pointing it out. And, like if you walk out of a really rough session, and I know I've been in a few rough sessions with you before too, where it's like, I just feel awful after that. I don't know if I did the right thing. I don't know if I said the right thing. I'm worried about this person. Okay, it's like, great. Okay, let's work through that then. Like, where is the worry coming from? What do you think that you did well in that session? And like, let's kind of look at this from a realistic perspective. Is there anything more that you can do in your role as a counselor right now? Or have we done it all? And usually the answer is no, there's nothing more I can do in my role, because what that countertransference really is it's pulling us into a different role. It's pulling us into like the friend role or the parent or something else where it's like, well, there is more I can do. I can go after them and make sure they get home safely, or I can, go pick them up and take them to a meeting somewhere. But that's not our role as counselors. And that's why we work with the families to make sure that that stuff's covered outside of our office. But really working in supervision to kind of like ground it back in reality and reaffirm and validate we have done our job here. And now let's talk about how we can take care of ourselves in this moment. We have the meditation room at the office. It's like, go take 5, go in there. Yeah. But the hard reality of it is it's a hard skill to do. And I definitely have days too, where I know that I'm taking it home with me at the end of the day. And there's some times where it's just like, all right, I'm just going to go to sleep. And then I'm going to wake up the next day and try it all again, because there are just days that hit harder, and you've just got to take care of yourself like you would anything else.
Yeah. No, and that's such great advice. That's why you're such a great supervisor, is being able to give such great advice. But I think it's interesting how, a lot of the stuff you were saying counselors need to do in order to keep their sanity and in order to, protect their well-being is the same stuff that we tell the youth to do. Right. And it comes down to that idea of like, if you don't practice these things, and if you aren't in a place of like mental peace, one, the youth's going to be able to feel it when you're talking to them, but also like, how can you help somebody else to achieve like a state of well-being in their mind if you're not at that yourself?
Exactly.
And they can feel it if you're talking to them and you're agitated or you're dealing with something else, your mind's somewhere else, or you're sad. You know what I mean? You really have to come in as a blank slate. Yeah. Because they pick up on everything. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's something to be said about like the concept of the blank slate, right? Because it's impossible for us to show up fully as a blank slate, because again, we're humans, and we wish a lot of the times that we could just shut everything off, and it's really hard to do. But showing up intentionally for them and practicing what you preach, kind of like what you're saying. I don't see my own caseload as much anymore, but when I did, it was like I wasn't going to assign them something or do an intervention or have them do a worksheet or try this thing or watch this movie unless I've already done it myself.
Yeah.
Because like you said, they're going to pick up on it. Teenagers are so good at detecting when we're genuine and not genuine. It's like their superpower. So they'll know that they'll pick up on that right away. But two, you don't know if it's even helpful, right? If like the stuff that we're kind of working with them on of like, oh, try this. If we haven't even done it ourselves, how do we know and believe that it could help them, right? And so then it's like, are we just telling them to do things just to do things, or are we doing it with intention? Are we saying it because we truly believe this could be beneficial for them because we've lived that experience and we know it was beneficial for us in a hard moment?
Yeah.
And I think that's something else to point to too, is like, a question I get a lot is like, do you have to have lived experience, right, to be a good counselor? My answer is no. I think what you need is a passion and an empathy, and to be able to connect to that empathy, because for somebody with lived experience with substance use in their life, maybe they can connect to that like very specific part of working with that kid. But we have all experienced times where we have felt unseen or hurt or felt like we couldn't control our emotions. I'm sure you and I both remember being a teenager and how out of control that could feel. Yeah. That's really what makes a good counselor, is being able to tap into that stuff. And that's what empathy really is. Like, okay, let me put myself in that. When I was really upset at that age, was it helpful for me to just hear like, oh, you've just got to go take a walk, if that wasn't something that's ever helped me before? And I think that's really what it comes down to, is like practicing what we preach and tapping into the empathy that we have and relating to our youth in some way, even if it's not completely linear.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with that so much. And to second that, I mean, that's something that I say to them a lot when I run the groups and I like recommend them to do something, or I suggest that they do something. I always tell them, you know, I'm not going to suggest for you to do something unless I've done it and it's helped me.
Yeah.
You know, and my only goal here is to try to help you. And yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like you said, they don't like to be told, you know, what to do. So I've realized like the way that I try to approach it is when they tell me that they're struggling with something, instead of saying, okay, you're struggling with this, you should do this, I'll say, you know, I've been through that too. At times I feel that way too. Here's what I did that worked for me.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that that's a way of giving advice that tends to resonate more than saying, you need to do this, or hey, you should do this, you should try this. Because whenever people hear you, like if it's a sentence starts out with you, they tend to shut down a little bit. But if they're just like, oh, this person's just sharing his experience with me, and he's telling me that he went through the same thing that I did, then it makes it more acceptable to them, and they're more likely to like heed that advice. I feel like.
I think youth really don't need another adult telling them what to do, because they get that in their own life plenty. What they need is a safe, secure adult figure that is listening to them and is validating them and truly tries to see them for who they are and not just their behaviors.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. That's all for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Goodbye.
Brought to you by Tarzana Treatment Centers. You can visit our website at www.tarzanatc.org or call 1-800-996-1051.